September 18, 1944. The southern sector of Peleliu. The air temperature hovered near 115 degrees Fahrenheit, a suffocating blanket of humidity and heat that felt less like weather and more like a physical weight pressing down on the lungs of every man ashore. The ground was not dirt, it was sharp, jagged coral that tore through combat boots and sliced skin like broken glass. For the men of the 1st Marine Division, this was not just an island, it was an oven designed to cook them alive before the enemy even fired a shot. Private First Class Arthur Jackson, a 19-year-old automatic rifleman from the 7th Marines, lay pressed against a ridge of white limestone, his body coated in a paste of sweat, coral dust, and gun oil. He was watching the men to his left die. The invasion of Peleliu was supposed to be a quick operation. Major General William Rupertus had famously predicted that the island would be secured in 4 days. He had promised a tough but short fight. By the morning of September 18th, the operation was in its 3rd day, and the reality of the situation had shattered every optimistic projection the command staff had made. The Japanese defenders were not fighting the war the Americans expected. The era of the banzai charge, the suicidal, screaming human wave attacks that had characterized battles like Guadalcanal and Tarawa, was over. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, the commander of the Japanese forces on Peleliu, had instituted a terrifying new doctrine of attrition. He had forbidden his men from throwing their lives away. Instead, he had turned the island into a fortress. Nakagawa's engineers had spent months hollowing out the coral ridges. They had constructed a honeycomb network of over 500 caves, tunnels, and reinforced concrete bunkers. They created kill zones where machine guns had pre-sighted lanes of fire that overlapped with mathematical precision. They didn't stand on the beaches to be shelled by the Navy. They waited deep inside the earth, safe from the bombardment, waiting for the Marines to walk into the trap. By the time Jackson's unit pushed into the southern peninsula, the 1st Marine Regiment had already suffered nearly 70% casualties. The 7th Marines were being ground down, yard by bloody yard. The objective was simple: clear the Japanese defensive positions blocking the advance toward the airfield. But blocking their path was a defensive complex that looked impregnable. Directly in front of Jackson's platoon lay a semicircle of 12 reinforced concrete pillboxes. These were not hasty field fortifications. These were masterpieces of defensive engineering. The walls were 3 feet of steel-reinforced concrete, impervious to rifle fire and grenades. They were camouflaged with coral rocks and palm fronds, making them almost invisible until they opened fire. Inside each bunker waited between 5 and 35 Japanese soldiers, armed with Nambu Type 92 heavy machine guns and Arisaka rifles. The pillboxes were arranged in a mutually supporting network. If a Marine attacked one, the bunkers on its left and right would cut him down in a crossfire. It was a perfect kill box. The platoon was paralyzed. They had tried to advance 3 times. 3 times they had been repelled by a wall of lead. Bodies of Marines lay baking in the sun in the open ground, unreachable. The standard solution for a problem like this was heavy support, Sherman tanks or naval artillery. But the terrain of southern Peleliu was a nightmare of steep coral ridges and narrow draws. Tanks couldn't traverse the razor-sharp rocks without throwing a track or exposing their thin belly armor. Artillery was useless. The Japanese were too close to the Marine lines, and the shells would likely kill as many Americans as enemies. The platoon commander was out of options. The sergeants were out of ideas. The advance had stalled, and with every minute they sat there, the Japanese mortars were dialing in their range. Arthur Jackson looked across the 150 yards of open ground that separated him from the largest of the pillboxes. It was a massive structure, the anchor of the enemy line, housing at least 35 soldiers. He did the mental calculus that every infantryman learns to do instinctively. A man sprinting in combat gear moves at perhaps 15 feet per second. The ground was uneven. The enemy had machine guns that fired 450 rounds per minute. To cross that ground was a death sentence. It was suicide. But Jackson also knew that staying put was a slower form of death. He looked at the faces of the men around him, exhausted, terrified, dehydrated. If someone didn't break the deadlock, they would all die in this coral oven. Jackson didn't ask for permission. He didn't formulate a complex battle plan with his squad leader. He simply checked the load on his M1918 Browning automatic rifle. The BAR was a beast of a weapon, weighing nearly 20 pounds fully loaded, firing a .30 caliber round that could punch through a tree trunk. He stuffed his dungaree pockets with every grenade he could find, fragmentation grenades for killing, and white phosphorus grenades for burning. Then Arthur Jackson stood up. He didn't run like a man trying to survive. He ran like a man trying to kill. He clamped the stock of the heavy BAR under his arm and sprinted into the kill zone. The Japanese spotted him instantly. The firing slits of the massive central bunker erupted with muzzle flashes. Bullets cracked the air around his ears, snapping like bullwhips. Rounds impacted the coral at his feet, spraying him with razor-sharp shrapnel. Jackson pulled the trigger of the BAR and didn't let go. He fired from the hip, spraying a stream of heavy lead at the bunker's aperture. His bullets couldn't penetrate the concrete, but the sheer volume of fire forced the Japanese gunners to duck. He was trading suppression for distance, buying himself seconds of life with every pull of the trigger. The distance closed. 100 yards. 80. 60. His magazine ran dry. Jackson dove behind a coral boulder, his chest heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He fumbled a fresh 20-round magazine into the weapon, racking the slide. He popped up and ran again. The Japanese fire intensified, a storm of metal seeking one 19-year-old body. 40 yards. 20. At this range, the geometry of the battle shifted. The narrow firing slits that gave the Japanese protection also limited their field of view. Jackson sprinted into the blind spot, the dead angle directly adjacent to the main gun port. He slammed his body against the rough concrete wall of the bunker. He was so close he could hear the Japanese soldiers shouting orders inside. He could smell the cordite and the sweat. He was inside their guard, but he still had to kill them. He pulled a white phosphorus grenade from his pocket. Willie Pete was a terrifying weapon. It burst into a chemical fire that burned at 5,000 degrees and could not be extinguished by water. Jackson pulled the pin, counted to 2, and shoved the canister through the machine gun slit. He turned his face away. A muffled thump shook the ground, followed instantly by screams. Japanese soldiers, their uniforms smoking, stumbled out of the bunker's rear exit and firing ports, coughing and blinding firing. Jackson was waiting. He raised the BAR and cut them down. But the bunker was huge. The phosphorus hadn't reached the deep chambers. He needed something stronger. A combat engineer who had followed Jackson's insane charge crawled up, dragging a satchel charge containing 40 pounds of composition C2 plastic explosive. Jackson grabbed the satchel. He set the 30-second fuse. With a grunt of effort, he jammed the heavy package through the main aperture, shoving it deep into the dark interior. "Fire in the hole!" he screamed, though only he could hear it over the ringing in his ears. He scrambled away, diving into a shell crater and curling into a ball. The explosion was cataclysmic. It lifted the massive concrete roof of the pillbox inches into the air before slamming it back down. A plume of dust, pulverized rock, and debris shot 60 feet into the sky. The concussion wave punched the air from Jackson's lungs. When the dust settled, the anchor of the Japanese line was a smoking ruin. 35 enemy soldiers were dead. Jackson stood up, dusting the coral debris from his uniform. He was alive. He checked his ammo. He checked his limbs. He was intact. A rational man would have retreated then. He had done the impossible. He had destroyed the main threat. He could go back to the lines, drink water, and let the rest of the company mop up. But Arthur Jackson saw something the officers in the rear couldn't see. He saw that the destruction of the big bunker had shocked the Japanese. Their defensive network relied on cohesion, and he had just punched a massive hole in it. If he stopped now, they would reorganize. They would shift machine guns to cover the gap. They would recover. He couldn't let them recover. He reloaded the BAR and began walking toward the second pillbox. The second position was smaller, housing 5 men and 2 machine guns, situated 80 yards to the northwest. The element of surprise was gone. Every Japanese soldier in the sector knew there was a madman in their perimeter. They were watching for him. But Jackson used the terrain like a master tactician. The coral ridges of Peleliu formed natural trenches and gullies. Jackson slithered on his belly, dragging the hot steel of the BAR through the dirt, flanking the second bunker. He approached from the east, using a jagged spine of rock to block the line of sight from the bunker's gun ports. The Japanese inside knew he was there. They began lobbing Type 97 hand grenades over the wall of their own bunker, trying to blast him with shrapnel. Jackson counted the explosions. Bang, bang, pause. He moved during the silence. He reached the wall of the second bunker. He had used his phosphorus. He had used the demolition charge. But he had noticed a design flaw in the first bunker. To vent the carbon monoxide gas created by firing machine guns in an enclosed space, the Japanese engineers had installed small ventilation pipes in the roofs of the pillboxes. They were only 4 inches wide, too small for a satchel charge, but wide enough for a gun barrel. Jackson scrambled up the side of the bunker and onto the roof. He located the steel pipe. He pointed the muzzle of the BAR straight down into the hole and squeezed the trigger. He dumped an entire 20-round magazine into the ventilation shaft. The bullets ricocheted off the concrete floor and walls inside, turning the interior into a blender of high-velocity lead. The screaming stopped abruptly. Jackson reloaded and fired another magazine, just to be sure. Silence. 2 down. 10 to go. The third and fourth bunkers presented a different problem. They were twin positions, built close together so that each one covered the entrance of the other. It was a classic mutual support trap. If Jackson attacked the left one, the right one would kill him. If he attacked the right, the left would kill him. He studied the ground. Between the 2 bunkers there was a narrow corridor of dead ground, a seam in the fields of fire that was perhaps 8 feet wide. It was a tightrope. If he deviated left or right by a few feet, he would be cut in half. Jackson took a breath of the superheated air and ran. He sprinted the gauntlet, bullets snapping at his heels. He reached the third bunker before the gunners could traverse their weapons. He jammed the BAR into the slit, fired a burst, and tossed a fragmentation grenade inside. The explosion gutted the small room. He didn't wait to check the damage. He pivoted and sprinted to the fourth bunker, repeating the lethal dance. Grenade, burst. Silence. In less than 20 minutes, Arthur Jackson had destroyed 4 reinforced fortifications and killed approximately 55 enemy soldiers. His uniform was soaked through with sweat. His hands were blistered from the heat of the BAR's barrel. The wooden foregrip was smoking. He was out of grenades. He was low on ammo. But as he wiped the grit from his eyes, he saw movement behind him. Through the haze of battle, he saw Marines from his platoon standing up. They were moving. The paralysis was broken. His one-man war had shattered the psychological hold the Japanese had on the sector. But the fight was evolving. The Japanese were adapting. As Jackson approached the 5th pillbox, he grew confident. It looked like the others, a concrete box with firing slits. He planned to use the blind spot tactic again. He crept up the flank, his eyes locked on the gun port, preparing to climb the roof. He never saw the trap. The fifth bunker had a rear tunnel exit, concealed by a pile of loose coral and brush, designed specifically to allow defenders to counterattack flankers. As Jackson passed the hidden hole, the camouflage was thrown aside. A Japanese soldier surged out of the ground, screaming, a bayonet fixed to the end of his long Arisaka rifle. The blade lunged for Jackson's kidneys. It was pure instinct that saved him. Jackson spun, swinging the heavy barrel of the BAR like a club. He fired from the hip at point-blank range. The heavy .30-06 rounds lifted the Japanese soldier off his feet and slammed him back into the tunnel entrance. But the gunshot had acted as an alarm. Inside the fifth bunker, Jackson heard the heavy thud of boots and the clatter of weapons. More men were coming out of that tunnel. He was standing in the open, 5 feet from the exit, with a half-empty magazine. Jackson dropped to one knee, leveling the BAR at the dark mouth of the tunnel. He held the trigger down. The narrow concrete tunnel acted as a funnel, channeling his bullets into the mass of men trying to exit. He burned the magazine in 4 seconds, stripped it, slammed in a fresh one, and kept firing until the bolt locked back on an empty chamber. When the smoke cleared, the tunnel was silent. 3 bodies lay tangled in the entrance. The fifth bunker was neutralized. 5 bunkers destroyed. 7 remained. But now, Jackson faced a new problem. He was alone, deep in enemy territory, and he was out of ammunition. He had fired hundreds of rounds. His pockets were empty of grenades. And worse, Colonel Nakagawa's command post had realized that their southern line was being dismantled by a single Marine. Orders were flying through the Japanese telephone lines. They were triangulating his position. They were organizing a counterattack. The element of surprise was completely gone. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The sixth pillbox was a tactical nightmare. Unlike the others, which were dug deep into the coral floor, this one sat atop a jagged limestone ridge 15 feet above the surrounding terrain. It was a sniper's tower in concrete form, commanding a 300-degree view of the battlefield. The Japanese gunners inside could see Arthur Jackson coming from 200 yards away. There were no blind spots here, no defilade, no shadows to hide in. Jackson lay pressed behind a cluster of boulders, his chest heaving, his hands shaking from a dangerous cocktail of adrenaline and dehydration. He checked his pockets. Empty. He checked his ammunition. 1 magazine left. 20 rounds of .30-06. That was it. After that, his 19-pound BAR would be nothing more than a heavy steel club. For the first time since he stepped off the line, Jackson hesitated. To attack that elevated position alone, with 1 magazine, was not bravery. It was suicide. But the battlefield has a way of providing miracles in the chaotic spaces between death. To his right, emerging from the smoke like ghosts, a Marine rifle squad appeared. 6 men. They were haggard, their dungarees stained black with sweat and red with coral dust. But they were moving forward. They had seen the gaps Jackson had punched in the line, and they were pushing through. Their sergeant, a man whose eyes were wide with the manic intensity of combat, spotted Jackson. He didn't ask for a sit-rep. He didn't ask for a plan. He saw the elevated bunker, saw Jackson, and understood the geometry instantly. The sergeant signaled his men. They opened fire on the front of the elevated bunker, their M1 Garands pinging rhythmically. It was a distraction, a noisy, violent feint. The Japanese gunners in the tower shifted their fire toward the squad, the heavy chatter of the Type 92 machine gun tearing up the ground around the 6 Marines. It was the opening Jackson needed. While the enemy was fixated on the rifle squad, Jackson scrambled up the blind side of the ridge. The coral sliced his hands, but he didn't feel it. He reached the roof of the pillbox. He found the vent. He didn't have grenades, so he used the last of his bullets. He jammed the muzzle into the pipe and emptied the magazine. 20 rounds. The screams from inside were brief. The sixth bunker fell silent. Jackson slid down the ridge, collapsing at the base. He was completely out of ammunition. The rifle squad had paid a heavy price for the distraction. 1 Marine was dead. 2 were wounded, bleeding out on the white rock. Jackson scrambled over to the bodies of the Japanese soldiers scattered around the bunker's perimeter. He needed weapons. He grabbed a Type 97 grenade, then another. He found 2 Type 99 magnetic mines, turtle-shaped explosives designed to destroy American tanks. He clipped them to his belt. Then he saw a dead Marine nearby, clutching an M1 Garand. The rifle was empty, but the Marine's cartridge belt was full. Jackson grabbed the belt. The ammunition was the right caliber, .30-06, but it was packaged in 8-round clips for the Garand, not 20-round magazines for the BAR. What followed was a moment of surreal, terrifying calm. In the middle of a raging battle, with bullets snapping overhead, Arthur Jackson sat down in the dirt. With trembling, bloody fingers, he began to strip the rounds out of the Garand clips one by one, pressing them manually into his empty BAR magazines. Click, click, click. It was tedious, maddening work. He managed to load 2 full magazines, 40 rounds. It wasn't much, but it was enough to kill. He didn't have long to rest. Colonel Nakagawa's counterattack had arrived. 40 Japanese soldiers, the reserve force of the southern sector, emerged from a tunnel network 200 yards north. They moved with terrifying discipline, not screaming, not charging blindly, but advancing in a skirmish line, using the terrain, hunting for the American who had broken their defenses. Jackson and the 3 surviving effective Marines from the rifle squad were the only thing standing in their way. 4 men against 40. The first shots rang out, and the squad's BAR man went down, his weapon jammed by coral grit. Jackson stepped into the void. He braced his weapon on a rock and began to fire. He didn't spray and pray. He fired single shots and short bursts. Bang! Bang, bang! He dropped the point man. He dropped the officer. The Japanese line wavered, but they kept coming. They had the numbers. They began to flank the small group, moving to encircle them. Jackson's first scavenged magazine ran dry. He slammed in the second, his last. This was the end. He knew it. But then the ridge behind the Japanese force exploded. The 7th Marines had arrived. A platoon of 40 men, pouring through the hole Jackson had opened, caught the Japanese counterattack in the rear. The crossfire was devastating. The Japanese soldiers were cut down in a hail of fire from 2 directions. In 3 minutes, the reserve force was annihilated. Jackson stood up. He was surrounded by friendly forces now. A captain offered to pull him off the line. "You've done enough, son," he said. "Get some water." Jackson looked at the officer, his eyes hollow. "There are 6 more," he rasped. "I'm not finished." He grabbed bandoliers of ammo from the fresh troops. He grabbed grenades. He grabbed a canteen and took a single swig of hot, metallic-tasting water. Then he turned south. The next obstacle was the Triangle, a complex of 3 mutually supporting pillboxes that formed the heart of the remaining defense. This was the hardest nut to crack. The bunkers faced each other, covering every approach with overlapping lanes of fire. 30 Japanese soldiers held the position. Jackson organized a hasty assault team of 12 Marines. He divided them into 3 groups. "You take the left," he shouted over the roar of battle. "You take the right. I've got the center." They launched the assault at 0847. The heat was now 105 degrees. Jackson led the charge across 60 yards of open ground. The center bunker opened up immediately. A Marine to his right's head snapped back, dead before he hit the ground. Jackson kept running. He reached the bunker wall, pulled the pin on a Japanese grenade he had scavenged, and tossed it through the slit. The explosion silenced one gun, but a second machine gun in the same bunker kept firing. Jackson climbed the roof. He found the vent. He fired his BAR into it until the magazine clicked dry. The center was secure, but on the right flank, the assault had stalled. The third bunker had a reinforced entryway that faced away from the American lines, protecting it from direct fire. The Marines were pinned down, eating dirt while grenades rained around them. Jackson saw the stalemate. He didn't hesitate. He sprinted across the open killing ground between the bunkers, a lone figure dashing through a swarm of angry bees. A bullet grazed his thigh, a hot, searing poker of pain that almost buckled his leg. He stumbled, but didn't fall. He reached the blind side of the third bunker, limping heavily now. He dropped his last 2 grenades down the vent. The explosion blew the heavy steel door off its hinges. 3 bunkers down. The triangle was broken. Jackson looked down at his leg. His dungarees were soaked in blood. The bullet had passed through the muscle of his thigh. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a throbbing, sickening ache. A medic tried to grab him. "You're done, Marine!" the corpsman shouted, reaching for a bandage. Jackson shoved him away. "Not yet," he said. He wrapped a torn strip of cloth around his leg, tightened it until his vision blurred, and stood up. 3 pillboxes remained. The 10th bunker fell at 0912. Jackson, dragging his left leg, approached it from the rear and dropped a satchel charge into the entrance. The 11th fell at 0921. Private Henderson, a fresh replacement, carried the explosives while Jackson provided suppressive fire, his BAR hopping in his hands as he kept the Japanese heads down. Then there was one, the 12th pillbox, the final guardian of the southern peninsula. It sat on a rise overlooking the landing beaches, a massive structure that had been killing Marines for 3 days. Jackson could barely walk. He was dragging his left leg like a dead weight. His vision was tunneling, the edges of the world turning gray from blood loss and heat exhaustion. But he wasn't alone. 3 Marines moved with him, a rifleman, an ammo carrier, and a man carrying the heavy tanks of an M2 flamethrower. The Japanese opened fire at 100 yards. Jackson dropped to a knee, biting through his lip to stifle the scream of pain from his leg. He mounted the BAR on a rock and opened up. He wasn't firing to kill, he was firing to blind. He raked the firing slits, forcing the Japanese gunners to pull back for precious seconds. "Move!" he screamed at the flamethrower operator. The man sprinted forward, the heavy tanks bouncing on his back. 50 yards, 40, 30. Jackson's magazine ran dry. He grabbed a Garand from the rifleman next to him and kept firing. Ping! Reload! Ping! Reload! The flamethrower operator reached effective range. He pulled the trigger. A stream of liquid napalm, ignited by a pilot light, arched through the air like a dragon's breath. It splashed into the main firing slit of the 12th bunker. The result was horrific and absolute. The sucking roar of the fire consumed the oxygen inside the bunker instantly. The ammunition inside cooked off, sounding like firecrackers in a tin can. At 0933, the guns of the southern sector fell silent. Arthur Jackson collapsed against a coral boulder. He tried to stand, but his legs finally refused to obey. He sat in the white dust, his uniform stiff with dried blood and sweat, his BAR resting across his lap like a holy relic. In 90 minutes, he had personally destroyed 12 reinforced bunkers and killed 50 enemy soldiers. He had single-handedly broken the back of the Japanese defense in the southern sector. As the medics finally cut away his trousers to treat the wound, Jackson didn't feel like a hero. He just felt tired. He closed his eyes and listened to the silence. Jackson survived Peleliu. He survived the infection in his leg. He survived the war. The paperwork for his actions moved through the chain of command with unprecedented speed. On October 5, 1945, a year after the battle, Arthur Jackson stood in the East Room of the White House. He was 20 years old. He wore his dress blues, the fabric hiding the scar on his thigh. President Harry S. Truman, a man who had commanded artillery in the First World War, looked Jackson in the eye as he placed the pale blue ribbon of the Medal of Honor around his neck. "I would rather have this medal than be president," Truman whispered. Jackson stood at attention, his face stoic, thinking of the men who were still buried in the coral of Peleliu. But the story of Arthur Jackson didn't end with a parade. Heroes have to live in the world they fought to save, and sometimes that world is complicated. Jackson stayed in the service, transferring to the Army Reserve, rising to the rank of captain. In 1961, the Cold War was at its zenith. Jackson was stationed at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, a tiny American outpost on the edge of a communist island. Tensions were razor-thin. Spies were everywhere. Jackson, now an older man, served as a security officer. One night, he discovered a Cuban worker named Ruben Sabargo in a restricted area. Sabargo was suspected of being an intelligence agent for the Castro regime. When Jackson confronted him, Sabargo lunged. It was Peleliu all over again, a split-second decision between life and death. Jackson drew his sidearm and fired. Sabargo fell dead. But this wasn't a war zone. It was a diplomatic minefield. The killing of a Cuban national by a Medal of Honor recipient could have triggered an international incident, perhaps even a war. The decision was made to bury the incident. Jackson was quietly ushered out of the military he loved. He had killed 50 men to save his country and was given a medal. He killed one man to protect its secrets and was given a discharge. It was a bitter pill, a reminder that the clarity of the battlefield rarely survives in peace. Jackson returned to civilian life. He carried mail for the Postal Service, walking the quiet streets of Boise, Idaho, his limp a subtle metronome of his past. For decades, he didn't speak of the war. His neighbors saw a gentle, aging mailman, not the angel of death who had cleared the southern sector. But as he grew older, the silence began to weigh on him. He realized that when he died, the memory of the men who fought beside him would die too. So he began to talk. In 2011, at the age of 86, Jackson returned to the Pacific. He stood on the deck of the USS Peleliu, a massive amphibious assault ship named after his nightmare. He spoke to 1,000 young Marines and sailors. He told them about the heat. He told them about the smell of the coral dust. He told them that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important than fear. He handed the ship's captain his Medal of Honor flag, one of only 2 a recipient is ever issued. "Keep this," he said, his voice cracking with age. "Keep it for the men who didn't get to walk off that island." Arthur Jackson died on June 14, 2017. He was 92 years old. He was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Battle of Peleliu. When they carried his casket to the grave in Idaho, under the endless western sky, it wasn't just a man they were burying. It was a testament to the raw, unpolished capacity of the human spirit to endure the impossible. 50 Japanese soldiers, entrenched in concrete, supported by machine guns and mortars, had tried to stop one 19-year-old boy. They failed. And because they failed, Arthur Jackson lived to tell us that even in the deepest pits of hell, one man who refuses to stop walking can make a difference.